Okay, so welcome to Economics Talks again. Um, we're looking at Edexcel. We're looking at 1.1.2, which is positive and normative economic statements. So it's quite simple, quite straightforward. I'm going to talk you through it. So a positive statement would be one where you say, you look at data and you say, I don't know, there are 50,000 people in Wigan. 50,000 people in Wigan. If somebody's made the effort to count the number of people in Wigan, and it's true that there are 50,000 people, that would be a positive statement. So a positive statement is one that relies upon verification and relates to data and is, if you like, an impartial statement about something. So we might say that Britain's economy is, I think it's now a $3 trillion economy. Might well be, or a £3,000 economy. Let's look that up. But the fact is, if I've looked up the data and the data says, look, we've spent time adding this up and Britain is a £3 trillion economy, then so be it. That's a positive statement. A normative statement is a statement that is a value judgment where we might say, well, I think we ought to spend more on the NHS, for instance, or I think the government should borrow less money, or I think the government should borrow more money. In other words, my statement is something that I believe should be the case. In other words, I'm making a statement that I think something ought to happen, or it's a personal, if you like, even an ideological statement. Okay, so that's the difference between positive and normative economic statements. The role of value judgments in influencing economic decision making and policy. Well, if you look at politicians are not economists, and so they tend to give you normative economic judgments. Okay, so if you are elected, and let's say you are a left-wing politician, you might well say, well, I think we ought to have more government spending on the NHS, something like that, and that might be how you get your votes. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily the best thing to do, because obviously what you'd have to do is look at the data, and you'd have to gauge whether we already spend enough money on the NHS, or whether there are maybe some other things that the government could spend money on. So I think it's difficult when you're in government to make rational, or if you like, positive statements about things, because you can say, well, we spend 6% of GDP on the NHS, and it might be true, and that would be a positive statement. If you say we ought to spend more on the NHS, then you are making a value judgment, and so we need to. Economists would argue that you need to use data wisely in order to come to your conclusion in relation to positive and normative statements. Okay,